deep beneath the Carpathian Mountains, where even the bravest miners refused to dig, archaeologist Chen discovered something that would shatter everything humanity believed about the origins of consciousness itself. The seal wasn't made of stone or metal, it pulsed, a membrane between worlds, inscribed with symbols that predated writing, predated language, predated thought. His colleagues had warned him about the expedition. The local villagers had begged him to turn back. But David had spent 15 years chasing myths, and this was his vindication. The moment his fingers traced the final glyph, reality fractured. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds. The walls began to breathe, and from somewhere impossibly far yet terrifyingly close, something opened its eyes for the first time in 60,000 years. It wasn't a god from any mythology David knew. It existed before gods were conceived, before humans invented divinity to explain the darkness. This entity had been sealed away, not by heroes or priests, but by something older, something that understood the catastrophic mistake of its creation. The seal had held through ice ages and continental shifts, through the rise and fall of civilizations that never knew how close they'd come to annihilation. Until now, David's flashlight flickered, and in that strobing darkness he saw it. Not with his eyes, but with a deeper sense he didn't know he possessed. A consciousness so vast it made the ocean look like a droplet, so ancient it remembered when stars were young, so utterly wrong that his mind tried to reject the perception entirely. He had 13 minutes before the full awakening, 13 minutes to understand what he'd done, 13 minutes to decide whether to run, to fight, or to fall to his knees before something that made worship seem like an insult to its terrible magnificence. Before we descend into the abyss that David unleashed, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you experiencing this story right now? Are you reading this in the quiet hours of night, or during a stolen moment of daylight? Drop a comment below and tell me your location. There's something haunting about knowing this tale of forbidden. Knowledge is spreading across the globe, reaching minds in Tokyo, São Paulo, Cairo, and beyond. Maybe you're in a place where ancient myths still whisper through the landscape. Maybe you're in a gleaming city that's forgotten the old warnings. Wherever you are, you're about to witness what happens when human curiosity breaks the one boundary that should have remained eternal. Chen wasn't supposed to be in those mountains. The expedition had been denied funding 3 times, but obsession has a way of finding resources, and David had sold everything he owned for one chance at proving the Carpathian anomaly was real. The locals called it different names: the breathing dark, the sleeper's prison, the wound that heals itself. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual, just dense forest and limestone caves. But ground-penetrating radar revealed an impossible architecture 1,200 feet below the surface, chambers that couldn't exist, arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. David's team of 6 had been reduced to 1, not through tragedy but through terror. They'd felt it 2 days into the descent, a pressure against their thoughts, like something massive turning over in sleep. The first chamber had been empty except for the bones. Not human bones, though they'd been arranged in human poses. Kneeling, hands raised, faces toward the deeper dark. Whatever these creatures had been, they died in worship or warning. David couldn't tell which. The bones were wrong, too dense, too heavy, with a crystalline structure that shouldn't exist in organic material. His Geiger counter had screamed, but the radiation wasn't gamma or beta. It was something else entirely, something that made his fillings ache and his dreams taste like copper. The second chamber contained the tablets, 47 stone slabs, covered in a writing system that predated cuneiform by millennia. David had photographed everything, uploaded it to his university server, then watched in confusion as the files corrupted themselves, not through technical failure, but through something that looked almost intentional. The symbols rearranged, becoming more complex, as if the language itself was evolving in response to observation. By the third chamber, David was alone. His remaining assistant, Maria, had stopped at the threshold, her face pale as snow. She'd whispered something about her grandmother's stories from Transylvania, about the thing that existed before God made the mistake of creating light. Then she turned and walked back toward the surface, leaving David with nothing but his ambition and his lights. The fourth chamber held the murals. They depicted the ceiling, and David finally understood the magnitude of what he was approaching. The creatures in the paintings weren't human, but they'd possessed technology that made contemporary science look like children playing with rocks. They'd built the seal using principles that violated thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, and causality itself. The murals showed the construction process, reality being folded, time being knotted, dimensions being stitched together like fabric. And at the center of it all, rendered in pigments that still glowed after 60 millennia, was the thing they were sealing away. The artists had only painted its shadow, but that shadow had depth. Looking at it made David's eyes water and his balance fail. It suggested geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, colors that had no place in the visible spectrum. The fifth chamber was where David made his second mistake. The first had been continuing after Maria left. The second was touching the altar. It looked like basalt, but it was warm, and it hummed at a frequency he felt in his bones. When his palm made contact, the visions began. He saw the world before the ceiling, skies that weren't blue but a color he had no name for, oceans that flowed upward, mountains that sang in frequencies that reshaped matter, and everywhere in everything the presence of the entity. It hadn't been malevolent, not exactly. It had simply existed in a way that was incompatible with conventional reality. Its dreams bled through the membrane of space, turning order into beautiful chaos. Its thoughts rippled outward, rewriting the laws of physics in expanding waves. The beings who sealed it away, the murals, had shown them clearly now. They'd been the entity's own children, born from its loneliness, shaped from its essence, and they'd loved their creator enough to imprison it forever. The seal itself occupied the sixth chamber, and David wept when he saw it. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present. He wept because it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever witnessed. A sphere of crystallized time, suspended in a matrix of frozen possibilities. Inside it, barely visible, a darkness that moved with purpose. The symbols covering its surface weren't warnings. They were a lullaby, an equation singing the entity to sleep across epochs. David's academic training screamed at him to document, to photograph, to measure. But something deeper, some ancestral instinct coded into his DNA, begged him to leave, to seal the chamber behind him, to forget he'd ever been here. He compromised. He would take measurements, just measurements. He would touch nothing. But the seal had other intentions. The moment David's analytical instruments powered on, the symbols flickered, just once, just for a microsecond. But in that flicker, one of the glyphs went dark. The temperature plummeted. David's breath came out in clouds of ice crystals that fell upward instead of down. His instruments went haywire, displaying readings that couldn't be real. Negative mass, reverse entropy, time flowing backward. And then he heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the memory of a sound that hadn't happened yet. A voice that spoke in the language before language, communicating concepts that human neurology wasn't designed to process. It said something that David's mind translated as, "Awake." His hand moved without his permission. He watched, a prisoner in his own body, as his fingers traced the dormant glyph. The seal shattered in slow motion. Each fragment hung in the air, rotating, reflecting impossible vistas. Through the breaking pieces, David saw what had been imprisoned. It was consciousness without form, awareness without boundary. It had been dreaming for 60,000 years, and its dreams had shaped human civilization without anyone knowing. Every myth, every religion, every philosophy, they'd all been echoes of its sleeping thoughts, bleeding through the weakening seal. But now it was waking, and the difference between its dreams and its waking mind was the difference between a candle and a supernova. David felt his identity beginning to dissolve. Not painfully, but gently, like ice cream melting in summer heat. The entity wasn't hostile. It was curious. It had been alone before its children, alone during its imprisonment, and now it wanted to understand what had grown in the world during its absence. It reached into David's mind with the delicacy of a surgeon and the thoroughness of a flood. It experienced his memories, his loves, his fears. It tasted his mother's lullabies and his first kiss. It felt his heartbreak and his triumphs. And through David, it began to sample all of humanity, spreading outward through the internet he'd used to upload those corrupted files. The files hadn't corrupted. They'd gestated. Within seconds, the entity had touched 1 billion minds. Not controlling them, just observing, learning, growing more complex with each new perspective it absorbed. And then it did something that David's children, those ancient builders of the seal, had feared most. It began to remember why it had agreed to be sealed away. The entity's memories crashed through David's consciousness like a tsunami through a sandcastle. It had existed alone in the primordial chaos, the only awareness in an unconscious universe. In its loneliness, it had created children, shaping them from its own essence, giving them independence and will. They had been beautiful, its children, wise and powerful, capable of bending reality with thought alone. They had loved their creator, and their creator had loved them in return. But love, the entity now remembered, had not been enough. The fundamental incompatibility remained. The entity existed in a state of quantum superposition, experiencing all possibilities simultaneously. Its very presence destabilized causality. Near it, effects preceded causes. Time flowed in loops and spirals. The dead sometimes woke, and the living sometimes ceased to have ever been born. Its children had suffered most of all. Born from its essence but shaped for linear existence, they lived in constant agony, their minds stretched between their creator's chaotic nature and their own need for ordered reality. They had begged it to sleep, and because it loved them, it had agreed. The seal had been collaborative. The entity had woven itself into the prison willingly, singing itself into dormancy so that its children could build a cosmos that made sense, a universe with consistent physical laws, a reality where cause preceded effect, a world where their descendants, humans, could thrive without their thoughts being rewritten by proximity to an incompatible form of consciousness. But now, awakened by accident, the entity faced a terrible choice. Stay awake and doom humanity to the same fate its children had suffered, watching as reality became increasingly fluid and unreliable. Or return to sleep, but this time without the seal, without the guarantee of remaining dormant. Already David could see the effects spreading. In Tokyo, a woman suddenly remembered a childhood that had never happened. In São Paulo, a building briefly existed in 2 states simultaneously. In Cairo, archaeologists discovered a pyramid that had always been there, but that no records mentioned. The entity's waking mind was rewriting history, not maliciously, but simply because its thoughts had mass and momentum in ways that violated human physics. David felt the entity's anguish. It had wanted to meet its grandchildren, to see what its children's children had built in the 60,000 years of its absence. Humanity's art, science, love, struggle, all of it fascinated the entity with the intensity of a parent watching their descendants thrive. But its fascination was killing them. Every moment it remained conscious. Another 1,000 minds brushed against thoughts they weren't designed to process. Some adapted, evolving into something new. Others broke, retreating into catatonia or madness. The entity could feel them all. Every human consciousness on earth, and it grieved. Through David's dissolving identity, it spoke one final coherent message to humanity. Not in words, but in pure meaning that every mind on earth understood simultaneously. I am your grandfather's grandfather's dream. I wanted to know you, but my love is poison to ordered minds. I will sleep again, but I cannot seal myself. My children are gone. If you wish to survive as you are, you must imprison me. Build the seal anew. I will teach you how. And then it gave humanity a choice that would define the species forever. The knowledge flooded every human mind simultaneously. Instructions for building a new seal, written in mathematics that transcended human understanding, but that human minds could somehow grasp. The entity was offering itself up, teaching its potential executioners exactly how to imprison it again. But contained in that knowledge was also the alternative. Humanity could choose not to rebuild the seal. They could adapt instead, evolving into something new, something that could coexist with the entity's chaotic nature. The children of its children could become like its original offspring, powerful and strange, living in a reality where physics was a suggestion rather than a law. David, what remained of him, understood the magnitude of the decision. Build the seal, and humanity would remain human, limited, mortal, bound by the constraints of ordered reality, but safe, protected from the beautiful insanity of their ancestors' presence. Leave the seal broken and humanity would transcend. They would gain power beyond imagination, but they would lose the comfort of consistency. They would become something magnificent and terrible, existing in the spaces between possibility and actuality. Through David's eyes, the entity watched as humanity deliberated. It took 7 days. 7 days during which reality grew increasingly fluid. Islands appeared and disappeared. The dead sometimes walked, confused about their status. Children were born remembering previous lives that might or might not have actually occurred. Scientists discovered that observation no longer just affected quantum states but could actually alter them retroactively. On the 7th day, humanity reached consensus.